Okay, so my topic here is mass event medical coverage, and this is really the triathlon addition to this, right? But what you learned today, you can apply to any mass event that you want to cover, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Now, this is not an in-depth, get down into the weeds description of all different medical events that you can cover, but kind of an overview of all this. No disclosure. Here are goals and objectives, and I include a picture of Angela and Stephanie from a previous Lake Placid, because I just want to say this can be fun, right? I mean, we all get anxious about these things. We all get nervous about ramping up to this, but it is an incredible event to watch and to be a part of. So I just kind of want to keep that in our minds, especially as they're standing there smiling before the event. Brief word of introduction. We're not going to spend a lot of time in this. The granddaddy of them all, right, is Kona. So the Ironman triathlon in Hawaii. Hopefully Steve's not having flashbacks to being like, in Hawaii. Began in 1978, and prior to the pandemic, of course, and the before times, as I like to say, triathlons are one of the fastest growing sports, and they did take a hit. Mass events took a hit during the pandemic period. Nearly 4,000 events per year, 50,000 participants across the United States and growing, and events are being added yearly. Let's think about here a little bit about our athletes that are participating. They're training for months. This is a long, if they're doing it correctly, a long training period. Many of them have overuse injuries. Many of them have sustained more than one overuse injury, and a lot of them may present or attend the event with one of these injuries. All of you, I think, know this. A triathlon is typically a swim, bike, run. However, in Maine, because we like to be a little weird, there are all kinds of different events that can be triathlons. There was a recent event called the Rubikai in Rangeley that was run, bike, kayak. Of course, that was in the very beginning of June, and nobody in their right mind swims in Rangeley Lake in the beginning of June. Distances vary. Sprint probably has the greatest variability in distances, and there could be everything from a 500-meter swim to longer distance swims, anywhere from a 12-mile bike ride, sometimes 5K, sometimes longer. The scripted ones are your Olympics, your half Ironmans, and your full Ironman competitions, and those are listed right here. So how do we figure out medical usage, right? Well, a lot of this stuff is intuitive, but maybe not. A lot of it depends on the race distance. Longer races, more personnel. Participant numbers. If you've got 40 people on a 5K, you don't need a full gigantic medical team, medical tent. Weather concerns, and we'll talk a little bit about this later. Where's your location? As Liz and others have pointed out, if you're way out in the willy wags, cover an event where you're 400 miles from a hospital, well, then you better have a full MASH unit on site to be able to handle all the things that you're going to be seeing. So in triathlons, what are our encounter rates? Well, shorter distance, anywhere from 15 to 50 encounters per 1,000 participants. But boy, if you have longer distances, adverse medical conditions, difficult course, that can be as high as 400 per 1,000. That's a lot. Okay, you better be prepared for that surge that can end up in your medical tent during the high periods of patient presentation. Honestly, a lot of what you're going to see is going to be minor: GI, fatigue, dehydration, derm. I want you to remember, though, that swim leg in triathlons has a higher rate of sudden cardiac arrest than marathons do. Okay, now think about that. Having had to extract people as a former lifeguard when they're having an issue like this is really tough to begin with. So it's just something to kind of file away as you're planning for one of these events. And because there's this risk of catastrophic injury and high volume of people that need care, we do not want to overload our medical facilities, and that's why we are there, right? We want to try to take care of as many as we can. So to kind of break this down, we're going to start with considerations. I think one of the first things that needs to be set up after that race director has been selected and members to help determine where the race is going to be and how it's going to go is your medical director. Okay, this really ought to be set months in advance. And we first learned that we were going to be medical providers for this event back in the end of February, and that began the process. You've got that race director and that medical director, along with the extended care team, really needs to meet frequently. Since February, with this particular triathlon upcoming, we have had all agency meetings, which is all comers, as well as smaller medical group meetings, if not every other week, sometimes weekly, since the onset. Your role as medical director, should you ever decide to do this, is pretty straightforward. You want to be able to comment and work with the race director on course safety. You want to be able to develop or find and utilize medical treatment protocols, help train your medical team, not only those that are at that finish line medical tent, but also for those that might be on smaller tents that are actually out in on the course. You got to organize those facilities, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well as we get farther in here. Documentation, we're talking about our electronic medical records, of course. Documentation is key. Fortunately, most of this is on paper. And then finally, we've got to be able to have active communication with our EMS and our hospitals that are in the surrounding area. Also have to have an understanding of who you need there. And again, we'll talk about some parameters for this as well. Logistics, getting people in and out. Not only people that are injured in EMS vehicles, but your staff. Where are you going to park? How are you going to feed them? They're all things that a medical director needs to be aware of and responsible for. Make sure that you have it. I mean, this goes, honestly, in this day and age, emergency action plans, got to have them, whether it's a sideline football coverage, a KVAC cross-country running race, an Ironman triathlon. Got to be aware of the environmental conditions. As many of you heard in that phrase in the past, if you don't like the weather in New England, wait a minute. It can change. It can be anywhere from 50 in rain to 99 and high humidity. We could have tropical storms, you name it. There was a tornado that touched down in Vermont yesterday. So this stuff, it can happen. Now, hopefully, ideally, we'll have our classic sort of Maine beautiful day, 85 sunny summertime weather. And all of this is going to depend on the difficulty, distance, and numbers. Lovely picture, right from Ironman's website. I don't know that Augusta has ever really looked that good, but it really is nice to see. It does. Little filter action, little filter fall, gorgeous. You're going to have those tree colors this time of year. So what are you going to see, right? So we're going to see a lot of common things. The swim, contusions, lacerations, that kind of stuff. Hopefully we're not going to have any envenomations in the Kennebec River, but I imagine, if you're out in, you come across a couple of Portuguese man-of-war out in the warmer waters, you're going to be in trouble. Bikes, abrasions, road rash, occasional fractures, over and under hydration, and then run. That's where we start worrying about things like heat illness, that sort of stuff. But a lot of it is what you would expect from runners who've just exerted themselves for 70.3, right? So it's exhaustion, it's fatigue, it's a little bit of dehydration. We have to be aware that as we're drawing in our medical providers, in particular for events that are held in a community like ours, while this is not outside their scope of practice, it is outside their usual scope of practice. So a lot of our volunteers, our medical volunteers, they're not going to have somebody walk into their office with hypothermia. Okay, that's just not something that typically happens. And so allowing them to have access to protocols and some training is useful to be able to run these events successfully. Really got to have clear protocols, and so we're actually going to talk about this as faculty at the end about the protocols to distribute out to the remainder of our treatment team. The things that we really need to be concerned about are all that we talked about today, right? I don't have to rehash those things. Exercise-associated collapse, sudden cardiac arrest, hypothermia, hyperthermia, et cetera, and make sure that everybody has this in advance. As a medical director, you really have got to be part of the race course review. How do athletes get in and out? How does your medical team get in and out? How does EMS get in and out? Where is the finish line medical tent going to be? Okay, as you take a look here, it doesn't really show up well, but finish line medical is around that giant sort of oval park in the middle of your screen here. And essentially where that is adjacent to the YMCA. You'll see it. There's a finish line chute, and then the medical tent will be off to the side. But this also, the schematic that you have here in front of you also describes other locations of medical personnel. Swim in and out, where your on-water resources are going to be. Where's transition? One of the things I very much like about our Ironman is transition 1 and 2 are the same, and transition 1 and 2 are very close to finish line medical. That's actually quite nice. But where are you going to put the EMS rigs? Okay, how are they going to get in there? The run is run on the rail trail, so where are you going to station those rigs in relation to the run is going to be key. And where you need to extract your swimmers. So this all has to be part of the medical director's role in determining where these things need to go. They really ought to have experience in this. I think the first time you cover an event like this is obviously not the time to be a medical director. Need to gain some experience as you're going through this. It may be that your first experience really is covering a 5K. That's actually nice. Seems completely inane, boring, and useless, but at the same time, it's a nice way to kind of break in and start to begin to think about these things and develop an EAP. Some of the smaller events, so like, your community 5Ks that might have 40 to 50 participants really probably only need an ATC or an EMT on site there because they're not going to have a high volume of people that need to be seen. Larger events obviously require multiple disciplines and multiple people involved. Just as a rule of thumb for physicians on these bigger events, think about roughly one physician for every 200 participants. Again, there's some wiggle room here, a lot of wiggle room actually, if you're in one of these really remote events. If you're covering a mass event in the middle of the Sahara, well, you better darn well up that number a little bit because you're going to see a lot more heat illness. If you're covering a small event that you say like a sprint triathlon with maybe a couple of hundred participants, you at least need one provider in the finish line tent and somebody out on the course, okay, to be able to handle that. Got to have unrestricted licenses. Should have basic training in EMS, BLS, and be well versed in the common medical conditions they're going to see. I think it's really key. Physicians that are covering these events have to have the authority to remove an athlete. Okay, you have to have that because otherwise you're liable for the outcomes. Okay. Who else do you need? I think this goes without saying. Nurses. Okay, they are important in the hospital. They are important in our EDs. They are very important for races like this. They have a number of skill sets in my mind that add to the treatment of athletes. Starting IVs, helping with assessments, labs, those sorts of things. So we recruit nurses to your cause. EMTs, paramedics for the same reason. Okay, my big concern right now is the enormous attrition of our EMTs and paramedics through COVID. And then if you think about on that day, right, so on the day that we're going to have is 31st of July, it's a Sunday in Maine, what's going to be happening? There's going to be a mass exodus of people driving down I-95 trying to get out of the state. If you've ever tried to get out of the state on a Sunday, it's brutal. There's going to be accidents. There's the usual stuff that's occurring in the community with a group of people now that are understaffed. So we have to really be cognizant of that and be kind to our EMT paramedics.
ATs moved their service from Sunday till Saturday night.
Oh, yeah.
Right by Cody Circle.
So I've been telling everybody, look, if you're going to be out and about on that Sunday, you really want to be away from Augusta. Yeah. Our ATCs, who have been so generous to help us out in the past, who have skill sets that are really useful for mass events as well. Residents and fellows, not only is this a great volunteer experience, it's a rewarding experience while you're at it. And med students, nursing students, EMTs, and physical therapists that are trained in the acute care of your athletes. Okay, I'm going to differentiate that between more people that are dealing with chronic conditions that are going to be on site. Got to work with the race director for your medical spotters too. I think they at least have to understand some of the issues that they might potentially see that day, whether it's trauma, whether it's heat, illness, and that's roughly one spotter for every 300. We'll talk a little bit about swim later, which is different. Again, good to have some variety on the course. That's at your transition areas, that's at your swim exit, that might be at your aid stations littered throughout the bike course. Other ancillary services, we don't want them in the main tent, right? You don't want chiropractic, massage, physical therapy in your main tent to clutter up that area where we want to reserve that for those athletes that have more acute injuries. We love having those folks there. We just need them to be adjacent to the medical tent, not in the medical tent with us. So where do we position this? Okay, I think location is key. This is a schematic from one of the articles I think is outstanding. It's an outstanding read, honestly, if you want to do mass events, especially triathlons. You'll note here that those blue double lines there at the top is essentially the finish line. And then there is that sort of cool down chute that you want your athletes to walk through, because you don't want them stopping and right when they finish, because then you get EAC, legs get wobbly, everybody's going to end up in the medical tent. You don't want your medical tent at the very end of your finish line, because then everybody goes through your medical tent, right? So you don't want that. You want to make sure that medical tent is close, has access to the finish line athletes, and is just off to the side. The other thing that's important to note is you want an area that has easy access for EMS in and out of the back of that tent. And I'll show you when you think about our location, I believe it is Chestnut Street that exits out the back of that tent, that has easy in and out access, that does not in any way affect the course whatsoever, that allows us to transport athletes that are seriously ill without disrupting anything else. How many tents do you need? So Boston Marathon, when I covered, we had 3 medical tents. Each medical tent, I think, had 20 separate bays of 6 separate cots, and that did not include the elite athlete medical area, okay? We got 20,000 participants, 30,000 participants, you're gonna need more than 1 medical tent, right? I think our participant numbers is somewhere around 2,000 overall. Again, okay, so this is a little bit better schematic here, right? So the finish line, as you guys can see, is that dark blue shaded area with the red triangles, okay? And then we will be just off to the side. Columbia Street, not Chestnut Street, my apologies. Columbia Street is our exit. There's also even a parking area behind there. The tent will actually be set up in the middle of that street, as I understand it. We'll have access on Saturday. But again, it's really nice where our transition area is in relation to our finish line. The only issue is that, and I've already heard some competitors talk about this, is that run from swim exit all the way up to transition. That's a bit of a longer stretch than many places.
A little bit of that, yeah.
So.
It's what, 400 meters?
For what? From
Between the swim exit and the transition point.
I walked it, so it's easily 400, easily.
Yeah, it's gotta be a third of a mile.
Yeah, Lake Placid, because they had to move things around, the swim exit to where the cycling started was pretty long. It was way over 400 meters.
Wow.
So, we'll talk a little bit about tent design. So these are the sort of the basics here: triage, intake, where you're going to do the care, and then basically dispositioning the person. Either they're going to exit that medical tent on their own, or they're going to end up in transport. Shorter events. This is what we used to run. We used to run the half marathon here in Augusta. We had a small little tent. Group of us worked in that tent. It was not too intense, so all of us did the role. So if you evaluate the athlete, you were documenting, you were doing intake and discharge. Okay, for bigger events, that's not practical at all. Try to keep intake and exit openings separate from each other, but relatively close to registration, so you can actually have those folks that are helping you with that be the same. And then again, separate EMS exit if you can help it. Got to have designated supply areas, including for your AED. Okay, it's got to be handy. It's got to be readily available to you. Sort of a classic sort of tent layout here. The only thing I don't like about this is the athlete exits a little bit farther away from intake, but all the same, this is as good as any other. And specific event, here's our medical tent layout that's coming to us from Lake Placid. So notice medical check-in and check-out. You've got medical supplies in each of your areas. There are partitions between the high acuity areas, moderate acuity, and low acuity. You've got a centralized nurse station and an emergency exit here for EMS vehicles. To get into the weeds of supplies is going to take us an hour. We don't have that time, but suffice it to say, the supplies have to be commensurate depending upon the event that you're covering. Smaller events, all you really need is stuff to get vital signs, right? I would encourage you to always have an AED, just from the perspective of you might have somebody in the community that has a heart attack on site that's not running in the race, and it's a nice thing to have. I've often thought about purchasing my own, frankly. Pulse ox, thermometer, blood pressure cuff, that's good. Larger races, you're gonna stock to diminish the opportunity for that large load to hit your emergency room. Okay, you want to avoid that if you can. So you're going to have much more in the way of things that you're going to have stocked. iStat machine's convenient. I actually looked into purchasing one. The one that I wanted was about $4,000, would stop me from purchasing one. But it's something I think I'd actually talk to Steve about having in the capital budget for next year because it'd be nice to have. So think about your medical tent being a really well-stocked urgent care, small emergency room, really well-stocked office that's out in the woods where you don't have easy access to an emergency room. That's kind of how you might want to think about this. That's going to see a higher patients. Very busy slide, okay, but this is, again, examples of medical supplies. The one to the right is the one that we were provided with that Liz dismantled, restructured, sent back, got more out of what we wanted for the event. And I think all of this stuff is really, again, what you want to do and have available to your athletes there. I think we agree we're not suturing anybody that day. We're going to ship sutures as well, just because we don't want to tie up our medical team for a lengthy time doing multi-layer closures, okay? Documentation, boring, okay? I apologize, we got to talk about it, okay? It's important, okay, that record that you have for the patient, but it's got to be effectively communicated. We've got to make sure that it is HIPAA compliant, it's securely located. Ironman, I believe, keeps all of this stuff. I think there's a specified amount of time that they keep it for, that if somebody is coming in and wants it later to be able to review. Word of just you're going to hear me say this again, but make sure on every piece of medical documentation that they have their bib number. I don't care what their name is necessarily. It's nice, Frank, that's great. Frank, bib number 3578, okay? That's got to be on every form that we use, okay? That's going to be key in hunting them down. This is the form that they have provided for us. I like it. I didn't make any changes to it. Didn't think there really needed to be any. As we were going to talk about in our apparatus, we might want to make some changes. I cannot do a talk about mass events without talking about Boston, right? This taught us a lesson. We probably should have known that in advance, but I think all of us clearly remember that day. That's got to be part of any discussion between race director, EMS, hospitals on any given event. I hope we never see it again, okay? But I fear that we will. Now, not all are terrorist related, right? You might have somebody that unfortunately suffers from dementia, drives onto your running course. You might have, like I believe it was China a couple of years ago, ran an ultra event where they had a sudden storm system roll in and killed 30 people with hypothermia. Okay, so it's not all terrorist events that we need to be thinking about here, okay? Race day. As a medical director, you've got to supervise and delegate your team. I mean, that's your responsibility. What I don't think you ought to be doing is getting caught up in individual patient care if it's a big event. You need to be freely available to work with your team to communicate across the depth of that course for issues that might occur at mile 50 or mile 25, let's say, on your bike course, okay? Got to have clear delineation for your medical volunteers. They ought to know and understand the full care plan. Communication is really key, and I think all of us know that. We've been in medicine for a long time. You've been in situations where you've seen where communication works effectively and where it doesn't. I think the one thing that never really gets said is be nice, be friendly, okay? Be concise, be directive, but be nice and be friendly, and it goes a long way to making things go really smoothly. I probably wasn't very nice to that person several years ago in the half marathon. So I want to talk a little bit about swim. Swim is kind of unique, right? So now you've got a mobile surface that's freely changing, and so it's something to really think about a little bit. You're going to need more spotters here, especially in water that's a little bit murkier. Okay, Kennebec clarity is, yeah. So somebody goes a couple of feet under in the Kennebec, you're not going to see them. So I think it's worthwhile to have more spotters on the river. Roughly one spotter for every 25 to 50 participants. Got to really know, okay, how are you going to communicate? That paddleboard, how are they going to communicate to that rescue boat that's on the river? How are they going to get to that athlete in time? I think it's really important. Again, remember, mortalities are highest on the swim portion of the event. But just general water considerations. What's the temp? 71 degrees. Kennebec was 71 degrees in June. To me, that's warm. Okay, I'm thinking, OOB might have been about 60 on a good August day, and that's probably, really generous. I think all of us remember the Rio Olympics in 2016 with the disgusting gross water they had in there. I think I saw one article, a lay press article, that said that if an athlete drank 3 teaspoons of that water, they were going to get a gastroenteritis, which is even just disgusting to think about, right? And so if there is a concern about water quality, there is a testing procedure that you can follow with this. That's beyond the scope of this talk, but know that that's got to be a part of your equation. And maybe that entails testing that day and canceling that day, okay? If you got a red tide going on, you're not going to want your swimmers swimming through the red tide. Need to be able to access the athletes for rapid and safe assessment, provide immediate on-course care, and then get them out of there if you can, okay? And again, you got to have the ability as a medical director that day to be able to say yes, no, okay? Big event, a lot of people coming from all over the place. Don't want to say no, but you got to be able to pull the trigger. Run and bike considerations are fairly similar. So, is your race point to point where you've got to string out your services? Is your race a single loop like ours is for the bike, which is about it's a 56-mile loop, where that farthest point out is now a good 20 to 25 minutes away from your finish line medical tent and transporting an athlete that distance? Or is it a multi-loop where you're going to be closing down streets, you're going to have a more encapsulated access to those athletes, kind of like a Lake Placid? You want to really limit disruptions going across your course, right? You don't want your EMS vehicles traveling at a perpendicular to your athletes that are in the midst of that race. And so that partly is design, but partly that day, if you know the lay of the land, you want to be able to direct your vehicles away from being in direct opposition to your athletes. And again, try to minimize your travel distances to obtain appropriate care. So at the farthest edge of our bike race, the hospital may be Miles Memorial. Okay, especially if one of our local rigs is called away to do something else. That's a separate hospital system entirely, okay? I think we tend to forget about this a lot, is that post-race meeting, where we all get together, we kind of decide, okay, what went well, what didn't go well, and then creating an after-action report based on that. This is also an opportunity to provide some emotional support. God forbid, I hope not, God forbid we have a significant medical event that results in a death or something catastrophic. Got to get together to be able to debrief in those instances, okay? And that really can occur right after the race. This is also where you begin to formulate the plan, especially as a medical director, for what you're going to do for any upcoming races. And then finally, think about having a meeting a little more remotely, 2 to 4 weeks out, to allow for some careful consideration about next steps, okay? Because that day, you're tired, it's the end of the day, you know, you might want to go out and have a libation, but after you go home in the next couple of days, you might say, geez, I really wish I had this. That's important information for future events, okay? I can't go through a talk like this without sort of talking about this. Medical legal considerations, this is not covered under, I mean, I think all of us know that now. The Good Samaritan laws do not protect you in any way for events like this. They are really there to protect you in the event of medical emergency. This is maybe a planned medical emergency, but it's still not, doesn't fall into that heading, right? Also check, we had an opportunity a few years ago to cover a tough mountain type, tough mudder type event. When I looked into it, the event did not have any liability coverage. There is no way I'm going to put our medical providers at risk by letting them cover event without any kind of medical liability and any kind of event liability in that setting. So you don't want to do that and put your own sort of medical liability at risk. If you can't get medical liability coverage, or if your carrier does not cover that, you can get 1 day medical liability coverage through USA Triathlons. They do have that. That's an up-to-date website. I checked this earlier this week. Single day coverage, low cost. It's kind of important. But there are other things that we need to consider here too, especially if you're covering an event out of state. The United States still, every state has their own licensure laws, and it can drive us crazy. Okay, there's been a lot of legislation to try to change this. I think it is a good idea to always check in whatever state you're going to determine whether or not your license, you can be either have a 1-day license, temporary license, or to be allowed to cover that event. For the winter event that we've all been asked to cover at Lake Placid, the New York State Legislature actually passed a law to allow physicians from out of state to cover that. It was passed in May. All right, so that's the level of depth sometimes that has to happen to be able to allow us to cover. And then to make sure that your malpractice is going to cover as well. Again, hey, these things are the triathlons are increasing in number, size, and participant numbers. It's usually safe, especially if it's well designed. Can be a lot of fun. I mean, it really can be. So hopefully that'll be us that day. And I want to put a quick plug in for the next event that we cover, and that's the Bonbrook Tread Fest. That's it. Bike course, run course. Maps are also available for this. And as you can see, sort of maybe you can kind of follow at that farthest point out there. That's an area that's down in Richmond. Okay, so you're kind of a ways away from where the medical tent is.